Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for the webinar, Helping Young People Develop Porn Literacy with Dr. Marty Klein. Dr. Klein, I think you're getting feedback on me here. You're the only one not muted. So if you can just at the top of your screen, just for now, mute the microphone. Okay, sorry about that. So for your information, this webinar is being recorded and all participants' microphones are muted. If you have any questions or comments, please enter them in the chat box. My name is Jackie Eaton and I am from the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute located in Saskatoon. The Prevention Institute is a provincial nonprofit organization that believes that all children, regardless of ability, deserve the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. We work in a variety of areas, including sexual and reproductive health, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention, perinatal infant health, early childhood mental health, child injury prevention, and parenting. The Saskatchewan Ministry of Health provides funding to the Prevention Institute to work in areas of particular pertinence to the sexual and reproductive health of Saskatchewan residents. Included in this program is a focus on adolescent sexual and reproductive health. One of the areas of particular interest is adolescent pornography use and its impacts. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marty Klein, joining us remotely from sunny Palo Alto, California. I checked the weather this morning and saw that Palo Alto was at 12 degrees Celsius, or that's 54 degrees Fahrenheit for Dr. Klein. And I was very envious because in Saskatoon this morning with the wind chill, it was minus 31 degrees Celsius or minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, yes. So while we're listening to Dr. Klein, we can all imagine that we're somewhere warmer and we can see the sunshine in his room. So Dr. Marty Klein has been a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified sex therapist for 39 years. He has conducted over 40,000 sessions with men, women, and couples. Marty is the award-winning author of 7 books on sexuality and relationships, including the groundbreaking Sexual Intelligence. Psychology Today simply says, to improve your sex life, buy this book. Marty frequently appears in the popular media such as the New York Times, CBC, and The Daily Show. His blog and electronic newsletter, Sexual Intelligence, are frequently cited as sources of innovative thinking about sexuality, culture, politics, and the media. Marty recently gave 2 U.S. congressional briefings on evidence-based sex education. Each year, he trains thousands of physicians, psychologists, and policymakers across North America, Europe, and Asia, some 40 countries to date, including in 2019 appearances in Calgary, Vancouver, and Toronto. Audiences can consistently call his talks thought-provoking, down-to-earth, and entertaining. We are looking forward to all 3. Thank you, Marty, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jackie, for that nice introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here with you today. And yes, it is a little bit warmer here than it is in Saskatchewan. When Jackie first contacted me, I confess I had not heard of the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. But as we began to talk about me doing a webinar for you, I went to the website and I looked through the programs that you offer and the quality of the speakers, and the work that you're doing there is just fabulous. So my hat's really off to you, and I'm glad that I am now familiar with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. I know that most of our audience today are familiar with the Institute. If anyone is joining us today or on this recording and does not know about the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, I would encourage you to check them out. And I must say thank you, Jackie, for doing all the arrangements, for inviting me and going through all the technical stuff with me and being so responsive about promotion and so on. So I'm delighted to be here, and we have 90 minutes together. The only disadvantage of the webinar is that I can't see all of your faces looking at me with great appreciation or great puzzlement, or and I can't hear you laugh when I say funny things. That's the worst thing about a webinar. But it enables me to connect with you in some places where I wouldn't be able to do that otherwise. Just a couple of notes on our program today. The first thing is, when I travel around North America, some people say, oh, Dr. Klein, you're pro-porn. And I want to make it clear, I am not pro-porn, just like I am not anti-porn. I'm in favor of people thinking clearly about pornography. For some people, they think that means that I'm pro-porn. Well, I'm not. But I am pro, let's try and think about these things clearly. According to Jackie, because I asked her about, okay, so who's our audience today? The clients that you serve are a pretty heterogeneous bunch. I mean, I'm talking to my colleagues today, to you. Some of you work with kids who are 10 and 12 years old, and some of you work with late teens. Some of you even work with young adults. So not only does that present a little bit of a challenge in terms of the material that I present, but what do I call your clients? Do I call them kids? Do I call them young people? Do I call them youth? So I'm pretty much going to use those expressions interchangeably. And occasionally I'll make a point about, well, here's something for 12-year-olds and here's something for 20-year-olds, but I'm going to let you do most of that work yourself. And as usual, I've prepared a much bigger slide deck than we're going to get to slide by slide. So that's not meant to torment you or tease you, but rather to share a few things on slides to give you something to think about after we're done that we didn't have time to get to today. So with that, I want to start with helping young people develop porn literacy. I want to make sure I can advance my slide. There we go. So porn literacy, what is that and why is it important? And the concern that some people have is, oh, porn literacy, that's just an excuse for encouraging kids to look at porn, or that's just giving them the wrong message that since we are preparing them to look at it, we're saying it's a great thing for kids to look at porn, which of course is not accurate. And how do we promote it, and how do we help adults, whether it's you, our colleagues, or the adults that you work with, or parents out in the culture, how do we help adults help young people to develop what I call porn literacy? Now, I want to take you back over 20 years now to Labor Day 1999. That's in the fall of 1999. Imagine that we were sitting around chatting, and imagine that someone said, gee, I wonder what would happen if the country were flooded with free 24/7 porn. I wonder what would happen if Canada, or the US for that matter, I wonder what would happen if the country were flooded, if everybody in the country could access online high quality pornography for free 24 hours a day. I wonder what would happen. Well, we know what happened because that's what happened starting in the year 2000. In the year 2000, that's when broadband came to the internet, much faster download speed, higher quality video, syncing of video and audio, and that's what enabled all of the pornography that we see on the internet today. And so I wrote a book about this eventually. It's called His Porn, Her Pain. And you'll be getting an email after our program with a link to how to buy this book. But this was the impetus for me eventually writing this book 3 or 4 years ago. And meanwhile, we've been going through a real-time experiment for the last 20 years. What happens when overnight, basically, when overnight, an entire culture has access to very high quality pornography all the time. By high quality, I don't mean the content, I mean technically high quality. Now, what we know about sexuality is that, and technology, is that every new technology is adapted for sexual purposes. And that's been true from the beginning of time. Pottery, believe it or not, was an enormous technological advance all the way back then. It enabled a new kind of food storage, and that, of course, had huge implications. Even that, the second that people were able to fire pottery, they started to decorate pottery with erotic images. So most of the new technologies that come along, as soon as possible, they're adapted for sexual purposes, whether it's the printing press, whether it's rubber, which was immediately adapted for condoms, whether it's nylon, which was immediately adapted for lingerie, whether it's photography. There was a big issue with photography when it first became commercially available in the 19th century. It was right around the time of the American Civil War. And immediately, photographers went out to the field to capture what was going on the battlefield. It was a brand new thing to actually have photographs of what happened on the battlefield. But photographers also, while they were there, the soldiers wanted the photographers to take their picture, and actually, photographers were hired by women back home to take sexy photos of them, to bring them to the battlefield and give to the soldiers, so that the soldiers would be reminded of how important it was to fight hard and come home. The U.S. government actually had to issue a policy forbidding the transfer of sexual photos back and forth during the U.S. Civil War. So immediately when this new technology of photography became commercially available, people immediately started using it for sexual purposes. That's the way that things work. And so, of course, when we have these disruptive technologies, whatever they are, whether it's the printing press, whether it's the electrification of downtowns, disruptive technologies not only present society with the challenge of how do you deal with this new technology, but how do you deal with this new form of sexual expression? And that's where we are today with pornography. We're still dealing with this newfangled internet thing, even though for a lot of us, we've never known any other world other than the world of the internet. I'm a little older, so I remember before the internet. But the internet, if you look at the history of the human race, still pretty new. And we're still dealing with the cultural impacts, with the emotional impacts, with the psychological impacts. But at the very same time, Canada, the U.S., every culture that is involved with the internet is also dealing with a new kind, with a range of new kinds of sexual expression that have to do with this new technology. So North America was still dealing with this newfangled internet thing when it had to start dealing with this newfangled internet porn. And so our societies are still reeling from this massive disruption of everyday culture. And of course, as sex educators, you all know that in the year 1999 or 2000, as today, there's a lot of sexual confusion. There's a lot of sexual confusion about what are appropriate forms of sexual expression. What is the meaning of consent? What about the interface between sexuality and alcohol? What about the way that faith traditions deal with sexuality? So there's a lot of unresolved sexual issues in the culture, and now the internet has brought a lot more complication to what is already a very complicated situation. So it's no surprise that when the 24/7 internet landed in everybody's laps, and then 5 minutes later, the 24/7 internet porn landed in everybody's laps, it's not surprised that it caused a certain amount of psychocultural political chaos, and that's where we are, as far as I can see. That's where we are today. And of course, part of that chaos is we're still not helping young people deal with either this disruptive technology of the internet, but particularly the disruption of internet pornography. We're not helping young people deal with that at all. The most common message in the culture, in Canadian culture, in American culture, the most common message out there in the culture about pornography is that, kids, it's bad crap, stay away from it. And the second most common message is this stuff is dangerous, it's radioactive, It's a problem. The less we have contact with it, the better. Those are the two most common messages that I see as I travel around North America. It's the most common messages that you hear on podcasts and other forms of media. And of course, that doesn't help young people. It doesn't help young people to say stay away from something without. It doesn't give them any tools. It doesn't give them a whole lot of explanation and so on. So let's talk about this what I call the continuing porn mess. Very sophisticated language there. The continuing porn mess. This is what I see when I look out the window here in sunny California. This is what I see as I travel around North America. Adults are still keeping secrets with each other about pornography. They're still not talking to each other honestly about it. They're certainly not talking to their kids about it. There's a great deal of mythology and just wrong information out there about what is the content of most internet porn, how is pornography actually made, and who makes it, and so on. There's a lot of fear about the effects of pornography. I don't know about you, but I make it a point to be on a few marketing lists of anti-pornography activists or organizations. You have them in Canada. We really have them in the United States. And there's just an enormous amount of fear about how porn is going to destroy your marriage, or porn is going to destroy your kids, or porn is going to destroy your community. So there's that going on. There's a lot of unclear definitions during the cultural conversation. When people talk about violent porn, how do they define violence? When people talk about how porn is degrading, exactly what does that mean? Because these are not technical terms, these are not measurable terms, and so sometimes the very heated conversation about pornography is based on language where there's no consensus about what that language means in the first place. And this is true with policymakers here in America for sure, and I know in Canada because I've participated in policymaking in Canada as well. Policymakers are attempting to make policy without a whole lot of input from people who actually know something about pornography. And that's unfortunate. Now, pornography is not the only arena in which policymakers do that, but it's true in a lot of arenas about sexuality, whether it's about reproductive health or campus policies. Now, what has happened is that as the cultural conversation about pornography has gone on, more and more stakeholders have joined the conversation. Mostly stakeholders who don't know anything about pornography or even sexuality, but for example, domestic violence activists. And of course, domestic violence is a very important issue, and we need more attention to domestic violence. But most people who are involved in domestic violence, they don't have training in sexuality, particularly they don't have training in pornography, but somehow they've decided that there's a link between pornography and domestic violence. And it's the same thing with a lot of other new stakeholders in the cultural conversation about pornography. And that's just making things more complicated. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later today. And finally, pornography is being blamed for social problems that existed way before pornography. And in fact, sexuality in general gets blamed for social problems that predate pornography, whether the conversation is about abortion or whether the conversation is about sex education, whether the conversation is about censorship of media. It seems that somebody always wants to blame sexuality in general for a decline in morality or for a decline in respect between men and women, or there's a lot of social problems that over the years, I mean, here in America, we had censorship of commercial films from 1933 until 1960. And one of the main reasons was that sex in films, which in those days, sex in films, that was people kissing on screen, or that was showing married couples sleeping in the same bed. That was blamed for the problems that America was grappling with in terms of the Depression and in terms of reintegrating soldiers after World War I, and in terms of dealing with the massive social change, the urbanization of the country. So sexuality in general gets blamed for a lot of stuff that is that it's not sexuality's fault. And pornography is just another aspect of how that's working. Now, there are things that have not changed since the internet came online. Everybody is so fond of talking about how the internet has changed everything. Everybody knows that the internet has changed everything. And I'm right here in Silicon Valley. So if there's anywhere in the world where anybody believes that the internet has changed everything, it's right here in Palo Alto, California. Well, there's a lot of things about young people that have not changed just because of the internet. Young people still want to feel like they're special and they're part of the group. Young people still anxious about fitting in, afraid of feeling foolish. Now, the names that mean kids give to other kids to insult them, those words have changed, but it's the same dynamic. The same dynamic of certain kids feeling marginalized or getting marginalized. The same dynamic of kids trying to get power in their peer groups any way that they can. The same dynamics of bullying and loyalty and disloyalty, that's still going on. And of course, since the beginning of time, young people have been interested in sexuality and eroticism and bodies. And since the beginning of time, grown-ups have been nervous about that. So let's keep in mind that the internet has not changed everything, that there's stuff that we've known about young people for a long time, and it's still true. It's still true. So what do we mean exactly? What do I mean by porn literacy? The culture, I don't think anybody would disagree that the culture is awash in pornography. Everybody who has a smartphone is 3 clicks away from pornography. And whether a person looks at porn or not, they're living in a culture that they're living side by side with people who look at porn. Whether you look at porn or not, you're living side by side with people who look at porn. And so everybody needs, whether people look at porn or not, they need a certain kind of cultural sophistication. So porn literacy is another way to describe a certain kind of psychocultural sophistication. And that involves looking at porn as it actually is in the real world, learning to make good decisions about it, and living with it with minimal negative effects. And there's a lot of things in the world that we want people to be literate about, not just pornography, whether it's alcohol, whether it's food, whether it's the internet in general, media in general. We want people to be literate. We want people to have a sophistication about how media products are created. We want people to know what are the exact effects. Now we're talking about vaping, right? There was a time when everybody thought that vaping was harmless. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people thought it was harmless. Now it turns out it's not so harmless. So the whole culture, imagine if vaping had been around for a long enough period of time, there would be a lot of, for example, commercial films that showed vaping, the same way that a lot of the movies made in Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s had a lot of people smoking cigarettes. And now when we look at those films, because so many of us have now had our consciousness expanded about smoking cigarettes, now we see that differently. Vaping has come and crested in such a short period of time. There hasn't been the opportunity for Hollywood or anybody else to make hundreds of movies showing vaping. But now we're beginning to get more literate about what vaping is all about. If you don't have children and you yourself don't vape, how would you know about vaping? But you need to be literate about that. So here are some aspects of porn literacy, which is how do you live in a world where porn is everywhere, and how do you make good decisions about it if you're going to watch it yourself? And what do you need to know about porn in the real world? So whether it's young people or whether it's older adults, we need information, we need communication skills. That is part of porn literacy, being able to talk about it. And talking about pornography doesn't necessarily mean talking about sex. It might mean talking about shame. It might mean talking about feeling like an outsider. if a 14-year-old is in a group of peers, and this 14-year-old is the only one who doesn't look at porn, they might have an issue about feeling like an outsider, or they might have an issue about being bullied. And that conversation, which springs from the experience of being marginalized around the issue of looking at porn, the conversation is not going to have that much to do with porn itself. The conversation is going to be more about how do you relate to peers, and what do you do with your feelings, and how do you decide whether to succumb to peer pressure or not. Those are conversations that all sex educators have been talking about. Adults need to facilitate with young people since the beginning of the sex education field. Whether the content is about birth control, or the content is about I'm uncomfortable with my fantasies, or the content is about I feel left out, or I feel ignorant, the same communication skills are necessary, right? So porn literacy must involve communication skills. And it helps to have general media literacy, and we'll talk about media literacy as we go along. And it helps to understand sexuality too. So these are the aspects of porn literacy. Now, in my book, His Porn, Her Pain, when I talk about porn literacy, there's a questionnaire. I've shrunk it down for our purposes today. Take a look at these questions for a second. Take a look at these questions for a second. These are questions that porn consumers need to be asking themselves. These are questions that young people especially need to be asking themselves. This is how you know if you can consume porn. First of all, how do you make the choice about whether or not to consume porn? And if you do, these are the kinds of things that you need to understand. So I actually encourage adults, parents, to share this questionnaire with their kids. Go through it with them together if you want. Lots of teachable moments in here, lots of language that you can use with which to talk to young people. And when people come into my office and they say that they're porn addicts, or they say that their couple has a lot of conflict because of porn, again, this is a valuable tool to help people talk about pornography, not just in terms of emotions and not just in terms of mythology, but actual on-the-ground experiences. Like, do you actually know that porn performers do not have quote-unquote normal bodies? You know, we're the ones with the normal or typical or statistically common bodies. Porn performers are the unusual ones. Do you know that? You need to know that. Now, you can enjoy imagery of people with unusual bodies. We do that whenever we watch football on TV or basketball on TV. We enjoy watching people with very unusual bodies doing very unusual things. But it helps to know that if we play football or basketball, we can't expect to do the things that they do in professional leagues on TV. So, porn literacy questionnaire. And we've already talked about this. So what are the kinds of things that we actually need to be talking about if we want to enhance porn literacy? Well, young people need to understand that all media are constructed. Some years ago, before the internet actually, when magazines were very popular, maybe you remember a magazine called Newsweek. I was in New York City and I was lecturing at Columbia University, and I happened to mention that day I had lunch with a person who worked for the magazine company that published Newsweek. I had lunch with the person who decides every week what goes on the cover of Newsweek. And I happened to mention that. And there were young people in the audience who gasped that, wait, there's a person who decides what goes on the cover of Newsweek? Now, of course, if you stop and think about it, of course, that's how it goes. But most media consumers don't think. You know, there's a person or a committee that decides what art goes on the cover of a video game box, or what is a video game called. I mean, somebody came up with the expression Grand Theft Auto, right? It didn't drop out of the sky. A bunch of people were sitting around, throwing around names, and this was one of the suggestions. And then somebody, it was their job that they get paid for to decide, yes, that's going to be the name of this video game. So young people need to understand that all media are constructed, that there are decisions after decisions after decisions. And if you look at, say, a smartphone, I'm in Silicon Valley. I actually talk to the people who design smartphones, who decide what color is it going to be? What shade of white is an Apple phone going to be? You know, there's a lot of shades of white. What shade of white is it going to be? And what size is it going to be? People make these decisions. And we want to, just like people decide, you know, what size a toaster is going to be. Somebody actually signed off on the decision. This toaster is going to be exactly this big. So this is a window into the world that I think young people can benefit from. And actually, it's kind of fascinating if we present it to young people that way. And of course, what we want to tell young people, and I'm going to say this over and over today, what we want to tell young people and what we want to tell ourselves is that porn is not a documentary, porn is not real life, and real sex in real life cannot feel like porn looks. It can't. It can't. Because the sexual imagery that we see in pornography is not just about sex. It involves editing, and it involves preparation, and it involves construction that doesn't happen in real life. It involves camera angles so that when people watch porn, we, the viewer, can see things that you can't see if you're having your own sexual experiences, because your vision is blocked, because your head doesn't rotate 360 degrees, because you're not on the ceiling looking down. So the way that porn, or any art, whether it's a Martin Scorsese film, or whether it's the Mona Lisa, or whether it's Grand Theft Auto, any art can give us views of things that we can't have in our regular, normal, everyday lives. And so if those views are constructed with the goal of, say, enhancing the eroticism, that means that our own erotic experience can't match the eroticism that's portrayed in the media. Even in Romeo and Juliet, you know, in Romeo and Juliet, if you know your Shakespeare, at the end, they both die, and it's very tragic. They each die because they die separately. It's very tragic, right? Very tragic. But then at the end of the play, the actors get up and they walk away. So if you want that kind of intense drama in your life, but you don't want to die, you can't have it. You can't have it. So that's about the constructed nature of media and how real life just can't match some of the portrayals of pornography. And we want to talk to young people about what they're learning from looking at porn, and it's not all negative. We shouldn't assume that any of it is negative for that matter. We want to talk to young people about what it is that they're seeing, or what they think they're seeing. And we want to at least be thinking about, or we want to talk to people about what they could be learning. For example, there's a certain amount of mutuality in most pornography that a lot of people don't realize is part of sex. It's very common for people to talk about how sex is all about male satisfaction. But if you look at most porn, if there's a man and a woman in the porn, and not all porn has one of each, but if you look at porn that has both a man and a woman, way more often than not, both of those people get sexual satisfaction. And more often than not, the male character in a film actually cares if the woman is getting sexual satisfaction. That's way the most common thing that we see in pornography that features both a male and a female. And we also want to talk about what porn leaves out. And I'm going to come to that in a little while. There's a teaser for you. But it's very important to notice what porn leaves out. If young people are old enough to understand things like moral panic, we can share that with them. As professionals, we need to get real clear that we're dealing in an age of moral panic, that we're dealing in an age where people are demanding social change and policy making based on fear and mythology rather than based on fact. And certainly this is not the first day in the history of Canada or America where that's true. There have been moral panics about sexuality for a very long time. There was an enormous amount of burning of rock and roll records here in the US in the 1950s. People were scared to death that rock and roll was going to be the end of morals. We could have another conversation about that later. There was a big, in America, there were huge bonfires of comic books back in the 40s because people thought that comic books were going to destroy young people's ability to read. And so comic books, and that the content of comic books was considered sleazy. And so people were afraid of that. There have been moral panics about sexuality. In fact, there's been a continuing moral panic here in America about Gardasil, the HPV vaccine for pre-adolescents. It's the vaccine that you give to kids when they're 11, 12, 13 years old before they become sexually active with a partner, and it protects them from HPV. And there are people in America who are demanding that those vaccines not be available to young people because they fear it will lead to quote unquote promiscuity. I guess the idea is that 14-year-olds choose to have sex based on whether or not they think they can get HPV. It's a complete misunderstanding of how 14-year-olds make decisions. In any case, it would be nice if people looked at the issues around pornography as teachable moments rather than get frightened by the prospect of the horrendous damage that pornography supposedly is going to deliver to our communities. So how do we promote porn literacy? We talk to young people. We ask them, what is pornography? Is that real sex? Is it a place to go for good sex education? Why do you watch this stuff? Not if you watch it, I'll kill you, but if you watch it, what do you get out of it? I think it would be a wonderful thing if every 15-year-old who looked at porn, or every 20-year-old who looked at porn, or by the way, every 47-year-old who looked at porn, I think it would be great if people would talk more about why they like to watch it. Why do you like to watch it? Why does some 12-year-old like to sneak peeks at naked ladies on their phone? What a great conversation. Now, of course, that conversation presupposes a certain kind of connection between an adult and a child. We don't want conversation about porn to be the very first conversation that a caregiver and a young person have about sexuality. So if you want to promote good decision-making around pornography, if you want to promote literacy around pornography, then we have to have conversations about sexuality first. So when I speak to audiences of parents, and inevitably some parent raises their hand and says, okay, I haven't talked to my kid about porn yet. My kid is X years old. What's the first thing that I should do when I talk to my kid about porn? And I say, the first thing you should do if you want to talk to your kid about porn is talk to your kid about sex. And if you haven't done that yet, go do that. And then inevitably somebody raises their hand and says, well, at what age should I start talking to my kid about sex? I say, if your kid can talk, then it's time. People always think I'm joking when I say that. But you're sex educators. You know that there's ways of talking about sexuality that is very, very age appropriate for 4 and 5-year-olds. You know, when you're bathing a 4-year-old and you say, oh, what a beautiful shoulder. Oh, what a wonderful chest. Oh, what a great belly. We have to back up here. Oh, what a great kneecap. When you got nothing between belly and kneecap, that's sex education. Kids learn, there's something there that doesn't get a name. I wonder what's up with that. talking to older young people, to adolescents or young adults. How do you feel before, during, and after you watch porn? How do you feel before, during, and after you watch porn? I also talk to adults about that. Using porn as self-medication for some people who feel tremendously lonely or tremendously depressed or tremendously angry. Pornography is a place that some people go where they can medicate themselves. That's something that doesn't get talked about very much. For young adults who look at porn, my question is, do you have a good sexual connection with somebody? It doesn't mean you're having genital sex. It doesn't mean that it's, but do you have some kind of erotic connection with a real person? Or is your entire, if you're 24 years old and your entire sexual experience is only with you and a screen, that's worth talking about, I think. That doesn't mean that everybody has to run out and have sex with somebody. By erotic connection, I mean somebody that you can hug or cuddle with when that's what you want. And by the way, if people are anxious about their personal safety or if people feel bad about their bodies, that's a separate conversation from, is porn a good thing or a bad thing? Too much of the cultural conversation about pornography is a substitute for people talking honestly about, I'm unhappy about my body, I'm unhappy about my sex life, I'm afraid that as I'm getting older, I'm getting less attractive. I feel vulnerable walking down the street. All of those issues which deserve attention, that's a separate conversation from pornography. So, myth versus reality. Common myths about porn. Myth, not true, not true, not true, not true. Got it? Not true, not true. Most common myth about porn, that porn is violent or women-hating. The overwhelming majority of pornography that you see on the internet features pictures of people who are smiling and they're glad to be doing what they're doing, and they're doing pretty vanilla stuff. Most pornography, pretty vanilla, mostly genital sex, male, female, male, small groups, big groups. Most pornography on the internet, this is a fact, this is not my opinion, this is a fact. Most pornography is happy, smiling people doing things that they want to be doing. By the way, they're doing things that that people come to me as a therapist and they say, we used to do that when we were younger, we don't do it now, and we're kind of sad about that. So things like cunnilingus, things like intercourse, things like hand jobs, that's what most pornography features. And the idea that most pornography is violent, and you hear anti-porn activists talk about the content of porn, and it's just staggering to me. People like Gail Dines, or people who say 99% of pornography is brutal. I just don't know what they're talking about. 99%, 50%, 30%. No, it's just not true. And the reason is very simple. The reason that most porn features happy, smiling people doing happy, smiling things, the reason is very simple. When people look at porn, that's what they want to look at. Most people who look at porn as an adjunct to masturbation, they don't find it really sexy to look at scenes of brutality. They find it really sexy to look at scenes of people having a good time having sex. So strictly from a consumer point of view, of course, most porn is going to be happy, smiling people. And indeed, that's what it is. Of course, there are people portraying characters who are playing sex games, people who are involved in S&M scenes, people who are involved in various kinds of kinky stuff. And you would need to know that, oh, I guess that's a sex game, if you wanted to be 100% clear about what's going on. But typically, it's not porn consumers who say that most porn is violent. When people talk about porn being violent, people don't walk around saying, oh yeah, I watch a lot of violent porn, and that's my favorite kind of porn. No, what the idea that porn is violent comes from self-described anti-porn activists. And we should be very aware of that. Another common myth about porn, Porn steals consumers from their partners. No, it doesn't. No one is dragged away from a vibrant sexual connection with somebody by porn. People have good connections with their partner sexually and they look at porn. People don't have good connections with their partner and they look at porn. But porn is not the thing that drags people away from a vibrant sexual relationship. You yourself know how hard it is to find a person that you really connect with sexually and really enjoy that connection with them. And you yourself know that you're not tempted to leave that vibrant relationship for the opportunity to look at porn all the time. It just doesn't work that way. Another common myth that porn use leads to antisocial behavior. The good news is no, it doesn't. There's one exception, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Another common myth that the porn industry promotes child porn. That makes no sense at all. Child porn is not manufactured commercially anywhere. It's not manufactured by the companies that manufacture the porn that most consumers look at. And frankly, from a strictly rational point of view, if porn is legal, if adult porn is legal, and porn companies are making a lot of money manufacturing and distributing legal adult porn, why would they also want to manufacture a product that is illegal, will get them thrown in jail for 1,000 years, and is looked down on by the people in jail so much that they are going to get brutalized in jail when it comes out that the reason that they're in jail is for making child porn. So the porn industry has absolutely no interest in promoting child porn. Another common myth that porn use leads to erection or desire problems. No, it doesn't. People have erection and desire problems. That's been true since the beginning of time. There's no reason to think that the one would cause the other. What sometimes happens is that people who use a lot of porn also have either personality features or behavioral features that would lead them to have a lot of erection problems. For example, college students who drink a lot, and I mean binge drink. College students who binge drink have a lot of erection problems. Male college students who binge drink have a lot of erection problems because the way that our plumbing is designed, it's hard to get aroused when you've been binge drinking, and it's really hard to have an erection or lubricate when you have been binge drinking. And as we know, most college students consume porn, particularly males. And so some people make the connection, but there's not a causality there. Another common idea that most participants in porn videos are emotionally damaged. Not true, not true, not true. In fact, there have been research projects that measured the emotional health of porn performers. The one difference between porn performance and non-performance seems to be, statistically, that people who perform in commercial porn started being sexual in their private lives earlier than non-performers. But they don't have a higher level of having been sexually exploited as children, for example. So that idea that when we're looking at porn, we're looking at the documentation of people who are damaged, not true. Now that there's a whole industry of anti-trafficking activists they're a new stakeholder in this whole porn question. Now they've sort of glommed onto the idea that actresses are trafficked into, or women are trafficked into performing in porn, which is actually not true. I live in California, and a lot of the commercial porn that's made in North America is made in Southern California. And if you go down there, when new porn shoots are announced, young women or women, they just line up around the block. They really want to be in porn. There's such a big pool of people who want to act in porn. Porn companies have no trouble finding those people. There's no reason that they would ever want to have somebody acting in a porn film that didn't want to be doing it. That would be such a big mistake for them, and they never do that. Plus, the government is just waiting to stomp on the porn industry with both feet the second they find any wrongdoing in the porn industry. So the porn industry actually does not employ underage people, does not employ people who don't want to be there, etc. And finally, another most common myth about porn is that if you have somebody who does not have a lot of desire for their partner and they watch a lot of porn, the way to increase their desire for their partner is to decrease the porn watching. It's what I call the idea that if you want someone to eat more broccoli, you should take away their ice cream. And I think you would agree that that doesn't work. If you have children, you know that that doesn't work. There is now, I'm happy to tell you, a compendium of recent research on porn, actual peer-reviewed research that's been gone through institutional review boards and that have large samples and that actually have high quality methodology. And if you go to realyourbrainonporn.com, that's a long URL, I know. They have from around the world, Japan and Western Europe and so on, from around the world, they have research on the various aspects of pornography. Who's watching it, why, how does it affect people, how does it affect relationships, and so on. So as I've said, the overwhelming majority of the content of pornography is happy people, is characters who are being portrayed as being delighted to be doing what they're doing. Unrealistic scenarios quite frequently, but happy unrealistic scenarios as opposed to unhappy unrealistic scenarios. And it's true that porn does show some troubling stuff. And the good news is that troubling stuff is a tiny minority, and it's really niche stuff. It's not like the average porn consumer watches a bunch of happy stuff and a little bit of troubling stuff. The average porn consumer watches only happy stuff. Then there are some people, a very small number of people, that they watch stuff that, as professionals, we might consider to be troubling, or for that matter, lay people might consider to be troubling. Scenes of extreme violence that are not intended to look like consensual games. But people who watch that's typically what they watch. And the rest of the human race tends to not watch that. Now, that said, when porn consumers look at images of dominance and submission and so on, it's all acting. It's all acting. Whether it looks like the people are enjoying it or not, it's all acting. It's not like somebody goes, some dangerous person goes and rapes somebody and then they film it and then they put that up on the internet as pornography. No, when consumers look at at stuff that we might consider troubling, it's still acting. It's still paid people being paid to do these various things. Whether we think it's a good decision for them to be accepting those jobs, that's a completely different story. But when consumers look at images of dominance or submission, it's acting, and it's been talked about ahead of time. It's not like some porn actress shows up to work one day, and while she's having a cup of coffee, the other actors, they grab her and they throw her down and they start having sex with her that's violent. That's not how it works. And again, we want people to be literate about what is the nature of the construction of this medium. So everything that people see, it's previously discussed, it's consensual, and it's predictable. And of course, it has safe words. If somebody wants the action to stop, there's a safe word, whether it's dinosaurs or whatever the safe word is. So at the end of the day, what porn is it's a library of human sexual fantasy. And some people don't like what humans fantasize about when it comes to sex. I can understand that. But we shouldn't blame porn for simply being a depiction of a range of human sexual fantasy. If anything, the opposite. We should be glad that there is documentation about the extraordinary range of human sexual fantasy. It helps us know that when a 12-year-old says that they have sexual fantasy about their cousin, that it doesn't mean that they're a pervert. That when some 14-year-old says that they have sexual fantasies about being spanked, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. And that's a really important thing for adults to know about young people and for adults to know about themselves. And of course, what we know is that fantasy does not predict behavior. Fantasy does not predict behavior in most realms of human experience. People fantasize after a long, hard week of work. People fantasize, I'm going to quit my job, rob a bank, and go to Tahiti. Most people don't do that, right? Do you know anybody who has quit their job, robbed the bank, and gone to Tahiti? No. But people talk about that. That's the nature of human fantasy. Now, in Canada, a couple of years ago, the House of Commons actually wanted to study the public health effects. Now, this is not a neutral proposition. Let's study the health effects of violent and degrading material. Okay, I would have preferred that they were interested in the public health effects of all sexually explicit material without making those judgments ahead of time, but okay. So the House of Commons passed a motion, let's study the public health effects of this kind of sexually explicit material. And they did. And they spent some time. They got a committee together. They studied it. This being Canada rather than the U.S. It was actually people on the committee who knew what they were talking about. In America, that committee would be a completely different kind of committee. And they came up with the conclusion that there's no evidence that pornography causes problematic behavior. So they did not enact this bill, M47, that would have attempted to control certain kinds of porn in Canada. However, and again, this is a wonderfully Canadian thing. The committee said, you know, what we have found out is that, boy, there's really a big need to provide more information about sexuality to young people and to adults. And Canada hasn't done that as much as I would like. But I think it's important to realize that here was a government who actually set out to study. Let's look at pornography that everybody or a lot of us think is problematic, and even starting that way, they couldn't find a problematic connection. So I think that's important. Porn in young people's lives. Porn in young people's lives. I think that when adults try to talk to young people about porn, but they haven't talked about sex or they don't want to talk about sex, I don't think that's realistic. I don't think it's realistic to think that we can say to young people, porn is bad for the following reasons, and expect that kids are going to believe us if we're not talking about some alternative vision of sexuality. So when we say real sex isn't like porn, any intelligent kid is going to say, aha, that's interesting. Tell me more about real sex. Tell me more about real sex. And that's what a lot of adults don't want to do. So if we want to have influence on young people about pornography, we need to talk about sexuality. And it's the same thing, by the way, it's the same thing about a lot of issues. I mean, there are people who want to talk about consent without talking about sex the way it actually is, which is kind of messy. In any case, in terms of porn, I'm always encouraging adults to talk to young people about sex, as well as talking to them just about porn. So what are young people doing with porn? Well, they're using it as sex education. I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, you could take the strongest anti-porn activist who says it's terrible that young people are using porn as sex ed, and I will agree with that 100%. It is terrible. It's terrible that we've put young people in the position where, in order to get information about sex, they have to go to some commercial product that's not designed for them, that does not claim to be accurate, that does not claim that it's going to be useful or valuable in any way. It's terrible that we've put young people in that position, but we have. But we have. Some young people are using porn to impress their friends or embarrass their friends. Some people are using porn in a vengeful way to get back at somebody, and that's awful. That's not a porn problem, but that is awful. It's a problem of teaching young people how do you manage your feelings when you feel really angry, you feel really hurt, or you feel really sad. What are some appropriate things to do? Some young people are looking at porn and say, okay, I want to be more attractive to my peers. What should I do? How should I talk? How should I dress? And so they're going to porn for that, which of course is problematic. One thing though that I hear as I travel around North America is this big fear that young people are looking at porn and they're seeing all this brutality and that they want to copy it or they think that that's normal. We shouldn't just automatically assume that kids are watching the most violent stuff that they can possibly get their hands on. There's no reason to think that they would do that. Adults don't do that, and kids don't do that. But it's kind of odd that when some people talk about being concerned about young people consuming porn, which I'm concerned about too, that they just go to the furthest extreme of, and that's what I'm afraid that kids are watching. And can't we all agree that that's bad for kids? And I do agree that I don't want kids looking at that stuff, but I don't assume that that's what they want to watch the most, because it isn't. I say this all the time. Real sex doesn't feel like porn sex looks. Now, if you say that to a young person, if they have any sense, what they would like to ask is, okay, and how does real sex feel? If real sex doesn't feel like porn looks, how does real sex feel? Very few young people are in a relationship with an adult where they could ask that question. It's really too bad. I would like for more adults to talk to more young people, presumably their kids or whoever they're the caretakers of, what real sex feels like. That doesn't necessarily mean what does real sex feel like in your vulva. No, but what does real sex feel like in terms of playfulness, in terms of connection, in terms of self-esteem, in terms of feeling graceful, in terms of feeling appreciated, things like that. And of course, there's way more to say about what real sex feels like. But real sex is not mostly as intense as pornography makes sex look. It can't be that intense. And that level of intensity is not what most people want minute after minute after minute after minute anyway. But what real sex is like for most people is not about intensity. It's about connection, and it's about taking a little vacation from the responsibilities of real life. As an exercise, you could ask yourself, if you said this to somebody, maybe even your own partner, or maybe even one of your pals over a coffee one day, if you said, real sex doesn't feel like porn looks, and the other person said, okay, well, how does real sex feel? Be an interesting exercise for you to imagine how you would answer that question. The technology behind the creation of porn makes it possible for porn sex to look extraordinary and seamless. Never any unexpected things, never any problems. And of course, real sex isn't like that. As I like to tell people, Pornography shows people with unusual bodies in unusual situations doing unusual things from an unusual perspective. Now, by the way, this is another talk, but reality just can't live up to the hyperreality of the internet. You know, reality isn't as predictable as the internet. It's not as neat and tidy as the internet. And by neat and tidy, I mean, if you do this, you know you get that. In reality, it's not like that. But in terms of the tremendous levels of stimulation of the internet, reality doesn't offer us nearly that much stimulation. In terms of the rewards, the validation of attention, in terms of the reward for paying attention to the internet, moment by moment by moment, reality can't keep up with that. I have people in my waiting room, you know, people come 4 or 5 minutes before their appointment, they sit in the waiting room for 4 or 5 minutes. Now, I've been doing this for 40 years. So when I opened my practice, people would come 5 minutes early, and they had a choice of, they could read a magazine in the waiting room, they could read what they brought with them, or they could sit with their own thoughts. This was before the internet. Now, I notice very few people ever open a magazine that's in the waiting room. Nobody ever brings a book or a magazine to session. What most people do, and what people don't do, is they don't sit quietly with their thoughts for 4 minutes before a therapy session. They're looking at the internet. They're getting rewarded for that attention by ping after ping after ping. And this is a real big problem. Invite me back and I'll do another webinar for you on that. But what I can tell you is that pornography is just a special case of that. You know, the hyper-real world that we get access to when we look at porn is just a special example of the hyper-real world that we get access to when we open up a browser or when we open up our phones first thing in the morning. So there are things that I think parents should be concerned about, and things that I want us as professionals to be able to support parents with. The number one thing that parents should be concerned about is not what is my kid looking at when they look at porn on the internet. The number one thing that parents should be concerned about is that the parents, are not available to provide the sexuality education that their kids need. That's the most important thing. Are you, as a parent, making it clear to your kid that you're available to talk about sex? And are you initiating conversations with your kid about sex? Too many parents are waiting for their kid to ask a question. You know, most parents, they don't wait for their kid to say, you know, Mommy, I think I'm of an age where I can start brushing my teeth. Don't you think it's time that you taught me how to brush my teeth? No parent waits around for that. Parents decide that it's their affirmative obligation to go and teach their kids about brushing their teeth, that it's important to do, how to get into the habit, and how to do it right. And it's the same thing with sexuality. Parents have an affirmative obligation to introduce this topic, and not just once, because what kids need to know when they're 6, and what kids need to know when they're 12, and what kids need to know when they're 16 is all different. So parents need to be initiating conversations about sex frequently, not every day necessarily, but you don't just do it one time. I mean, as a sex educator, doesn't it drive you crazy when parents say, at what age should I have the big talk with my kids? No. That's the wrong approach. We don't have one big talk with our kids. We have a long series of conversations, Parents should be concerned if their kids are feeling guilty or ashamed about watching porn, if they're feeling confused by what they see, if they're having nightmares about about porn or about sex, if they withdraw from their peer group because they either because they fear that they're the only ones having sexual fantasies, or they fear that they're the only ones who are not having sexual fantasies. If kids are showing a lack of empathy and respect about it, in general, that's a problem. If it looks like it's around sexuality or gender, parents should be concerned about that, of course. And if kids talk about hating their body or hating their sexuality, I wouldn't lay all of that at the feet of porn. I mean, we live in a culture that hypersexualizes young people so much that it's easy for any 12-year-old young woman or young man to think my body isn't good enough. And so they'll hide their bodies or they want to mutilate their bodies. And so those are the kinds of things that I think parents should be concerned about. What parents don't need to worry about is, I'm afraid if my kid looks at porn, that the porn will, if they're looking at the wrong kind of porn, it'll make them gay or kinky, or, it'll turn them into a child molester. Or another thing parents don't need to worry about is that porn is going to get my kid interested in sex. Every kid, sooner or later, if they're healthy, they get interested in sex, whether porn exists on the planet or not. Every kid, including the parents, every kid sooner or later becomes interested in sex if they're healthy. So you don't need to worry that porn is going to be the gating factor in whether or not your kid becomes interested in sex. Porn does not turn kids violent against women or anybody else. And if you're concerned about what lessons your kid is learning from porn, talk to your kids. Talk to your kids about, I really don't want you to be watching sexual imagery, but if you are, let's talk about what's in it. Some people, a parent could say, they look at movies of sex where some people are unhappy. Are you looking at videos where people seem unhappy? If you are, let's talk about it. We've talked about most of this. Some people complain that porn is a male-dominated medium. That happens to be true. If that is of concern to a parent, I think it's perfectly reasonable to talk to a young person about that. This is a medium that's created historically mostly by men for mostly male consumers. Both of those things have changed quite a bit. What we know now is that at least a third of porn consumers are female. And what we know is that an increasing number of people who create porn are female. And by the way, an increasing amount of porn that people watch is made by consumers. And when consumers make porn, the proportion of women involved in that goes up even higher. So, by the way, the fact that porn is made by females doesn't guarantee that the content is going to be more or less objectionable. It doesn't guarantee anything. But if a parent is concerned that porn is made by men, okay, talk to your kid about that. And as sex educators, or as educators in general, I think most of us, rather than a harm reduction model, we like a health promotion model much better. And so I want to make sure that parents understand that there's a goal that's even better than trying to protect their kids from the harm of porn, and that is promoting sexual health in their developing lives. By the way, social media and pornography are converging, and in some ways, there's no distinction anymore. If you look at what people are posting about themselves, a lot of it is deliberately titillating. It might not be people undressed having genital sex, although there's plenty of that. If you go to Reddit, if you go to Instagram. But we shouldn't think that there's this clear, bright line around pornography that separates it from not pornography. And that's not a complaint about how porn is bleeding into the rest of life. It's just a recognition that when you give people the tools to express themselves, one of the things that they're going to express is their sexuality, whether they do it by showing nude pictures of themselves or whether they do it by showing pictures that involve teasing or the eroticism of experiences of food and so on. So we shouldn't be surprised that these are converging. Masturbation, as Woody Allen used to say, sex with somebody you love. A certain amount of the conversation that people have about that they're uncomfortable with porn is really that they're uncomfortable with masturbation, whether it's their own, whether it's their partners, whether it's their kids. People usually look at porn as part of masturbating. if people don't want to talk about masturbation, there's very little point in talking about porn. And if masturbation is not acceptable, then you can bet that porn will be not acceptable. It's like saying, how do you like The Daily Show? Well, if someone says all television is crap, there's no point in discussing the finer points of The Daily Show, right? So questions that I want to know is masturbation acceptable to the person who's looking at porn and masturbating? Is masturbation acceptable to the cultural environment that they're in, whether that's parents or whether that's their faith tradition? Some faith traditions not comfortable with masturbation. And whoever is going to follow a faith tradition and masturbate at the same time, they have to figure out how to reconcile those two. And of course, there's a lot of pain in people's lives about trying to reconcile. The Christian Bible, by the way, doesn't mention masturbation. A lot of people just assume that it does, and that they assume that God is angry with them for masturbating. Actually, the Bible doesn't mention masturbation. However, because a lot of people are looking for some comment from Scripture about masturbation, they look in other places. They can't find it under masturbation. How about they look to see what the Bible has to say about lust? The Bible talks about lust. What does the Bible have to say about purity? The Bible talks about purity. The Quran talks about purity. What does the Bible say about self-control? The Bible talks about self-control. Whether these are good places to look for guidance about masturbation, that's a religious question. I mean, that's a question that everybody has to decide for themselves. Personally, I don't think that ideas about purity are all that relevant to decision-making about masturbation. Self-control would be closer to it, but again, most religious traditions, when they talk about self-control or when they talk about purity, they make the assumption that there's something inherently dirty or inherently that sexuality needs redeeming, that sexuality is stigmatized, and that it has to be contained. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with an individual deciding that they want to engage in sexuality within certain limited contexts. But that's different than sex, the idea that sex is bad unless it's in a certain context. We talk about values, professionals, we talk about values like honesty and consent and responsibility. There are a lot of people who feel like that's not enough of a box to put sexuality in, that it's dangerous even with those things, unless it's within a much smaller context. So when you're engaged professionally and talking to somebody about porn, you're probably going to have to talk about masturbation. Hopefully you're comfortable with that, and hopefully they're comfortable with that. Parents need to clarify their views, their values about masturbation. You can influence kids. You can influence young people about masturbation. You can get them to not do it if you're willing to damage them enough. If you're willing to make young people feel really, really, really guilty about it, you can limit how much a kid masturbates. But you're taking a big chance of damaging that kid. That seems to be pretty clear at this point. So when parents ask me, how do I discourage my kid from masturbating? I say, why do you want to do that? And then people say, well, you know, that's our faith tradition. Okay. I ask parents, how do you plan to discourage masturbation without damaging their sexuality? How do you plan to discourage masturbation in youth without negatively affecting their later adult, even if married adult, sexual expression? I haven't heard a good way to do that. I haven't heard a good way to describe how you actually get young people to stop masturbating without making them feel bad that they have the desire to masturbate. And there's certainly more to say about that. So what is the impact of porn use? Some people say, Dr. Klein, you don't understand how much pain people are in about pornography. Not true. Not true. I hear it in my office every week. People say they feel guilty about it. People say they look at porn and then they feel bad about their bodies. People say they feel bad about keeping a secret. People say they feel bad that their partner keeps a secret. So people have genuine pain around pornography. And we need to be aware that people feel this way, and we want to be able to address it. The science, however, is very clear that there's a lot of benign non-effects. There's a lot of non-effects of porn use. Porn use isn't addictive, for example. It doesn't increase, except for this one small population, doesn't increase people's propensity to act out, and it doesn't undermine people's ability to be intimate. There's a certain number of people in the world who have a lot of trouble being intimate in a relationship, and a lot of those people look at porn because a lot of every group of people looks at porn. A lot of people who run red lights look at porn. A lot of people who go to the supermarket and buy milk use porn. So if you take a bunch of criminals and you measure how many of them look at porn, you are going to get a huge percentage of criminals look at porn, because a huge percentage of any group of people looks at porn. Doesn't porn exploit women? That's a matter of opinion. That's not a matter of fact. Because the first question we would have to ask is, well, what do you mean by exploit women? What do you mean by exploit women? There are people who say that if pornography portrays cunnilingus, that's an exploitation of women. And if pornography portrays fellatio, that's an exploitation of women. If pornography portrays two men with one woman, that's an exploitation of women. And then if pornography portrays two women with one man, that's an exploitation of women. It's not hard to see porn exploiting women if you expand your definition enough. When people talk about how porn exploits women, one of the things that I ask them is, you describe to me what pornography would look like that doesn't exploit women. And most people, what they're describing is not pornography. What they're describing is a video of somebody going to the supermarket. However, I think that the conversation about does porn exploit women is a perfectly good thing for people to talk about. It's a perfectly good thing for people to ask, what do we mean by exploitation? It's a perfectly good thing to ask, is there a difference between fiction that portrays the exploitation of women, if that's what you want to do? Is that problematic? When Shakespeare portrays the exploitation of women, or when Downton Abbey portrays the exploitation of women, is that a problem? I think that's an important conversation to have. If we can have the conversation without shaming or moralism. Too much of that conversation is about, I know what exploitation of women is, you don't, or I know that it's bad, you don't, and we have to stop it. And that's not a helpful conversation. I just want you to notice that what has happened since the increase of pornography in the last 20 years. According to the FBI and the Centers for Disease Control and so on, the rate of sexual assault has gone down, the rate of divorce has gone down, and the rate of child sexual exploitation has gone down. Now, any of these, of course, is problematic, but the rates in the last 20 years of these things has gone down. And therefore, the idea that porn causes these things, that clearly is not true. And by the way, this is not my opinion. These are facts. These are government statistics. And by the way, this is not just in Canada and the US. This is true around the world in cultures that are different from ours. Japan, Hong Kong, Croatia, the Czech Republic. So the data defies the idea that that porn causes things like sexual assault. Now, there is an exception, or there's something that we need to know about, and that's what a lot of people call the dark triad. The dark triad is a combination of three personality traits: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And it turns out that in people who have this grouping of personality traits, these people are more vulnerable to being affected by looking at porn and acting out. That's not to say that if you have these traits, if you look at porn, you will act out. It just means that statistically, you're more likely to act out after watching porn than if you don't have these traits. So the dark triad, these character traits, they involve low empathy and responsibility, grandiosity, depression, comfort with violence, having sort of a transactional view of relationships rather than an intimacy view of relationships. Most of the people with this combination of personality traits, they're male. And if they act out, it's in general, the acting out is not only around sexuality, it can be about violent crime in other ways. But if you're working with a population that has these character traits, again, it's all three of them together, not just one or the other, but all three of them together. These are people for whom we do want to pay special attention to how are they making decisions about watching porn, and to what extent are they absorbing the wrong ideas about pornography. But the good news is that for porn consumers who do not have this grouping of character traits, porn's not a problem. So we're going to skip over resistance to porn literacy. What about young people who watch too much porn? I want to know, what are they getting from watching it? And if they weren't watching, what would they do instead? Do they have other ways of comforting themselves? Do they have other ways of stimulating themselves? We need to do a mental health assessment if we're working with young people who are watching too much porn. Asperger's, very common feature of young people who are watching too much porn, because it's just so much easier to connect with people, and they don't get a lot of the negative feedback that they get from their peers. Same thing with depression and anxiety. We want to assess for that with young people who are watching too much porn. And we shouldn't blame porn for young people who are acting out if they're passive aggressive or impulsive, even if it's around things like sex and relationships. We don't necessarily want to blame porn. And the way to intervene with a person like that is not by intervening on the level of porn, but rather to talk about respect and impulsivity and all of that. So I really wish we had some more time, because there's so much more to say. I want to tell you about porn addiction. We're not going to do that, but please read the slides. I do want to mention that with sexting, young people are sexting. It's a way of exercising autonomy. It's a way of acquiring status. Kids do not realize that they don't own the media rights to their own bodies. They don't realize that they do not have the right to consent to sex. It's a funny idea. Young people don't realize. We're always telling young people, don't let anybody touch you. You own your own body. Young people do not own their own bodies. In a lot of ways, young people do not own their own bodies. And one of the ways in which they don't own their own bodies is they are not allowed to document their own sexuality. They're simply not allowed to do that. And in fact, the age of consent in Canada for sexual behavior is 16, but the age at which sexual imagery is considered pornographic, is child porn, is 18. So you could have two 17-year-olds be sexual together and it's legal, but if they take a video of that legal activity and they distribute it to their friends, they're distributing child pornography. And professionals need to understand that although the age of consent is 16, that's consent for behavior, it's not consent for documentation. And so we want to make sure that young people understand they do not have the right to document their own sexual feelings, their own sexual activity. And the law is pretty clear about this. And in Canada, you administer that law in a more humane way than we do here in the US, but it is the law. And there are young people in Canada getting in a lot of trouble, just like in other Western countries. The most dangerous thing about sexting is the legal side of it. And the second most dangerous thing is that it can get out of people's control. Young people live with the internet so much that they don't think of it as a dangerous thing. They think of the internet as either benign or positive. They're not thinking about the internet could be an opportunity
Sorry
for
to
me to get
interrupt,
hurt.
Dr. Klein, but I
And
think
so
it's 2:30. So
while we want to be positive
unfortunately,
about
I
young
wish
people's
we could go
sexuality, we also want them
absolutely.
to know that there are certain ways of expressing your
That
sexuality where you can get hurt. Remember, they don't grasp the idea that they don't own the right to either have sex, and they certainly don't own the right to document. Now, here is selfie culture. We see selfies all the time. Now, there are people who are doing dangerous things and taking selfies. Now, there are selfies at funerals now, which is a new thing to me. With this kind of selfie culture, it's hard.
Thank you so much. I
Well,
wish
I'm
we
going to
did
finish my
allocate more
sentence.
time for
I'm going
this.
to
It has
finish
been a
my
fabulous
sentence
webinar.
and say
We do
that
have a few
we need to make
questions,
sure that young
so
people understand
what I
that there's
may
a
do is just
difference
ask for
between
Dr.
benign
Klein to
selfies on
provide
the
some
one
answers,
hand
and then when I
and
send up the link
documenting
of the
their
recording
sexuality on
along
the
with
other
Dr.
hand.
Klein's
And
website
it's
and
not
the
always a
other
clear, bright
website that was
line,
mentioned
so
in
we need to engage them in a
the
conversation
webinar, as
about
well
what would
as
be
the link to the
appropriate selfies
slides,
and what would be
then
dangerous or
I
illegal
hopefully will be able to
selfies.
answer some or
Now,
have some of those
thank you
answers
for
to those
joining me.
questions.
I'm happy to
Again, I
have
am
had this time with
very,
you.
very much
I'm going to turn
appreciative
you over to
of
Jackie.
Dr. Klein. I've seen him in person, and it exceeded my expectations this webinar. So thank you very, very much for your expertise and your words of wisdom. Included in when I send the email later on, it probably won't be until tomorrow because we'll have the link. I will be sending a link for a survey. So please provide us with your feedback and any comments as far as for future webinars would be greatly appreciated. And thank you so much for spending your time with us this afternoon. And thank you very much, Dr. Klein. Enjoy the sunshine. We will be thinking of you in our very cold weather we're having right now. So have a wonderful day. Okay, take care. Oh no.